Ever since she was old enough to understand stories, her parents told her a tale that would shape the very foundation of her identity. It wasn't a fairy tale or a bedtime fable, but something far more personal, something that explained the strange marks on her skin and the faint, flickering images that sometimes surfaced in her dreams. They said there had been a fire. A devastating, accidental blaze that had consumed much of their home when she was just a baby. According to them, it happened on a cold winter night, when a faulty space heater sparked in the nursery where she slept. Flames spread quickly, black smoke choking the air, her cries piercing through the chaos. Her father, they said, broke down the door and rushed in blindly, braving the fire to pull her tiny body from the crib. Her mother would always add, voice trembling with practiced sorrow, that it was a miracle she survived at all. Doctors didn't think she would make it. The burns were severe, the trauma immense, and she had spent months in and out of hospitals, wrapped in gauze, barely clinging to life. The story became almost sacred, repeated on birthdays, whispered in moments of family closeness, offered as a reason why she was special, why she was stronger than most. Whenever someone asked about the faint pink scars that curled around her arms and peeked out from her collar, she'd recite the same lines her parents had given her, "There was a fire when I was a baby. I was lucky to survive." She said it like a badge of honor, a tale of survival that made her feel brave even if she couldn't remember it. Her mother would sometimes tear up when she talked about the night, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, kissing her forehead and calling her, "my miracle girl." Her father, quieter about the event, would simply squeeze her shoulder or nod solemnly when it came up, as if the memory was too painful to relive. And she believed them. Why wouldn't she? They were her parents. They had saved her. They had carried her through fire. She never questioned the scars on her body. From her earliest memories, they were just there, pale, raised patterns across her shoulders, small patches on her legs, a slightly tighter texture on the skin near her ribs. They were part of her, like her eyes or her hands. When she was little, she would trace them absent-mindedly with her fingers, wondering what it would feel like to have smooth skin like other kids, but never resenting them. Her parents had told her again and again, these were the marks left by fire, a fire that nearly took her life. To her young mind, the idea was both frightening and strangely magical. She had survived something most wouldn't. That made her different, even heroic in some vague, unspoken way. The story shaped how she saw herself, how she navigated the world, and it explained the odd looks people sometimes gave her when she wore short sleeves or changed in the locker room. In school, whenever someone asked about the scars, she repeated the words her mother had taught her, "I was in a house fire when I was a baby. I don't remember it, but my parents say it was really bad." Sometimes people gasped, their eyes wide with sympathy or curiosity. Other times, they looked uncomfortable and quickly changed the subject. Either way, the reaction always made her feel a strange mix of pride and detachment, like she was telling someone else's story. Still, the scars occasionally brought a sense of shame she couldn't quite name. She wore long sleeves even on warm days, avoided swimming parties, and learned how to position her body in pictures so the worst areas wouldn't show. Her mother would gently encourage her not to hide, saying things like, "You're beautiful just the way you are." Those scars tell a story of survival. And so, she held on to that belief, that she was a survivor, a miracle child, and let it comfort her during moments of doubt. But as she entered her teenage years, that comfort began to shift. The scars, once symbols of courage, started to feel like question marks. They didn't match what she imagined burns to look like. Some were too even, too patterned, and others lacked the discoloration she saw in images online when she searched for burn survivors. The internet opened up a world she hadn't been exposed to before: forums, medical sites, support groups, and slowly, inconsistencies began to emerge. Questions she had never thought to ask started forming in the quiet corners of her mind. Why weren't there any photos of the fire? Why had no one else ever spoken of it? Why did her parents become so uncomfortable when she asked about the details? Still, she pushed those thoughts aside. The story had to be true. It had been told to her for as long as she could remember. She bore the proof on her body. She was the girl who survived the flames, wasn't she? As she grew older, the story her parents had always told her started to fray at the edges. It wasn't any one moment that unraveled it, but a quiet, creeping realization that something didn't quite make sense. In high school, during a class project on local history, she found herself digging through archives at the library. They were instructed to choose a historical event from their town, a natural disaster, a political moment, a tragedy, and find newspaper clippings, records, or interviews to build a presentation. She thought immediately of the fire. It seemed perfect, personal, emotional, and, presumably, documented. After all, her parents had described it as a significant blaze, one that had destroyed part of their home. It would have made the news, wouldn't it? Fires involving infants almost always did. So she asked her teacher if it would be acceptable to do her project on the fire that happened when she was a baby, and the teacher, with a warm smile, encouraged her to explore it. She went to the local library after school and started searching through microfilm and digitized newspaper archives from the year she was born. It was exciting at first, like a detective story. She scanned headlines for any mention of house fires, scrolling carefully through old issues of the town's newspaper, expecting to find something, anything, that might validate the story she'd been told all her life. But there was nothing, not even a small mention buried in the back pages. She searched the dates her parents had told her, and then the months before and after, broadening her range in case they had been mistaken. Still nothing. Her excitement turned to confusion, then unease. Could it have been missed somehow? She went to the local fire department, heart thudding, and asked if she could access public incident records from that time. The receptionist was polite but firm, telling her that archived reports could be requested through formal channels, but it might take weeks. She filled out the paperwork anyway, trying to calm the sense of dread that had started to bloom in her chest. At home, she casually brought it up to her mother while they were doing dishes, trying to keep her voice light. "Hey, Mom, what was the date of the fire again? I'm trying to look up something for school." Her mother paused, her hands freezing in the soapy water. "Why?" she asked, her voice tight in a way that made the girl straighten. "Just for a project," she replied quickly, not wanting to raise alarm. Her mother offered a vague answer, early February, she thought, or maybe late January. It was a blur, she said softly, almost to herself. Her father, when asked separately, gave a different date entirely, late March, he was certain. The inconsistency hit her like a cold wind. She had never thought to doubt them before, but now she couldn't help it. If the event had been so traumatic, how could they both be so unsure about when it happened? That night, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling and tried to quiet the storm of questions swirling in her mind. Maybe she was overthinking. Maybe the story had just been buried in a local news cycle, or the fire wasn't big enough to make headlines. But that didn't explain the different dates. It didn't explain the lack of photos, none framed on the wall, none tucked into albums. Most parents kept baby pictures, even from hospital stays. Hers were oddly few, and always cropped tightly around her face, hiding most of her body. She remembered asking once, as a child, why there weren't pictures of the house after the fire, and her mother had replied vaguely, it was too painful to keep any. At the time, she had accepted that. Now, it felt like a convenient excuse. The more she looked, the more she realized how little actual evidence there was. No records, no photos, no consistent details, just a story told and retold, like a script her parents had rehearsed. And for the first time, the thought crossed her mind, what if there hadn't been a fire at all? She tried to ignore the growing suspicion, to tuck it away beneath schoolwork and social obligations, but the questions wouldn't leave her alone. They sat like stones in her stomach, heavy and unrelenting. Each time her fingers grazed the scars on her body, she felt them not as signs of survival, but as unanswered questions. Something in her had shifted, and she couldn't unsee the cracks that had formed in the story of her past. She didn't want to believe her parents would lie, not about something so serious, so defining, but the inconsistencies wouldn't let her rest. She began to think more critically about everything, the way her mother's voice always wavered when pressed for details, how her father never offered specifics unless prompted, and how both of them changed the subject whenever the topic lingered too long. She needed answers. Not the kind that came from family stories, but hard, factual truth. One afternoon after school, when she knew both her parents would be at work, she made a decision. Her heart pounded in her chest as she let herself into her parents' home office, A room she was never told to avoid, but one she instinctively understood was not for her. The filing cabinet stood against the wall, dull and uninviting. She hesitated only a moment before opening the first drawer. At first, it was filled with mundane things, tax forms, insurance documents, receipts, all neatly labeled and arranged. But she kept digging, searching for anything dated around the year she was born. In the back of the second drawer, she found a folder labeled with her name. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out and opened it. Inside were a handful of medical records, some hospital bills, and what appeared to be a briefcase summary. Her eyes scanned the documents, expecting confirmation of the fire. But what she found instead stopped her breath. There were hospital intake forms from when she was just 14 months old, detailing injuries she had sustained, bruises, fractures, and lacerations, none of which matched what she had been told about burn damage. The attending physician had made several notes, one of which mentioned inconsistent explanations provided by guardian. Another referred to a suspected non-accidental injury, and listed a recommendation for a social worker evaluation. Her throat went dry as she flipped through the pages. There was a police report, barely a page long, noting that her injuries had occurred while under the care of a babysitter. The report didn't name the sitter, but it referenced a pending investigation, the outcome of which was marked as case closed, insufficient evidence. Nowhere in the documents was there any mention of a fire. Not a single reference. Nothing about smoke inhalation, burns, or emergency services responding to a house fire. The truth, so long buried beneath the story she'd been fed, was beginning to emerge. She sat frozen, the folder open in her lap, heart thudding in her ears. The words on the pages blurred as tears stung her eyes, but she couldn't stop reading. She found a letter addressed to her parents from Child Protective Services, outlining mandatory counseling and supervision guidelines following the investigation. There were photocopies of follow-up visits and notes from caseworkers. It was all there, the truth they'd hidden. And she didn't understand why. Why lie? Why create a story so elaborate, so consistent, and hold on to it for her entire life? What were they trying to protect her from? Or were they trying to protect themselves? She closed the folder slowly, her hands cold and numb. Every memory she had, every bedtime story, every whispered reassurance about being a miracle, now felt like a performance. A well-rehearsed script meant to obscure something darker, something she hadn't been ready to face. She stayed in the office for a long time, trying to process what she had uncovered. The pieces began to fit together in a way they never had before. The lack of photos, the vague answers, the discomfort in their voices. The scars on her body weren't from flames, but from hands. Hands that should have protected her. And suddenly, she felt untethered, like everything she thought she knew about herself had been built on sand. She put the folder back exactly as she had found it, careful not to disturb anything else. As she closed the drawer, she felt a strange kind of grief settle over her. Not just for the truth, but for the years lost to a lie. For the little girl who believed she had been saved from fire, when in reality, she had been hidden from it. She didn't speak about what she had found. Not right away. For days, she walked through her life in a daze, her mind constantly circling the truth she had unearthed. It sat inside her like a weight she couldn't shed, pressing into every thought, every interaction with her parents. She would look at them across the dinner table and wonder how they could pretend so effortlessly. They smiled and asked about her day, made casual jokes, talked about weekend plans, all while knowing the story they had raised her on was a fabrication. She listened closely now, searching their words for slips or signs of guilt, but they offered nothing. Her mother was as warm as ever, her father steady and silent, and it made the truth feel even more surreal. Had they convinced themselves their version of events was better? Had they believed the lie so deeply they forgot it was one? When she lay in bed at night, her mind replayed every moment from her childhood with new, harsher lighting. The bedtime stories of fire and survival now felt like betrayal disguised as comfort. She remembered how her mother used to trace the scars gently, calling them beautiful, calling her brave. It hadn't been bravery. It had been pain. Real, unexplained, misremembered pain. She remembered the times she'd cried in frustration as a child, begging to know more about the fire, only to be met with silence or gentle distractions. All this time, she thought they were protecting her from trauma. Now she realized they had been burying it. Not just from her, but maybe from themselves. What haunted her most was the thought that they might have watched it happen. Maybe not the abuse itself, but the aftermath, and instead of facing it, they'd constructed a fantasy in which she was saved by heroism, not failed by neglect. She couldn't shake the image of that police report from her mind. Inconsistent explanations. Suspected non-accidental injury. Those weren't just bureaucratic terms. They meant that someone, a nurse, a doctor, a police officer, had looked at her injuries and seen something more than a simple accident. They had seen harm. Someone had hurt her, and no one had paid the price. No arrest, no follow-up case, no justice. She didn't even know the name of the person who had been watching her that day. Her parents had never mentioned a babysitter in their stories. That figure had been scrubbed out of the narrative entirely, replaced by smoke and fire and heroic rescues. She began to wonder, had it been someone close to them? A neighbor, a family friend, someone they had trusted, and maybe still knew. The not knowing was like a slow poison. It twisted her thoughts until everything felt tainted with doubt. In school, she began to withdraw. The fire story had been part of her identity, something she had shared proudly, something that made her feel strong. Now, she couldn't even say the word, fire, without feeling like a fraud. Her classmates noticed the shift. She was quieter, less engaged, distracted. One friend asked if she was okay, and she forced a smile, nodding. She wanted to scream the truth, to drag it into the light and let it burn. But she didn't know where to begin. Who would understand that the story she had built her entire sense of self on had never been real? That she didn't know who had hurt her, only that they had, and her parents had covered it up with fairy tales and silence. Eventually, the silence became unbearable. One evening, sitting alone in her room, she pulled out a journal and began to write. She wrote everything she remembered from the documents she had seen, everything she had felt since uncovering them. She wrote about the scars and how she used to think they made her special, and how now, they made her feel lost. Page after page, she emptied herself onto paper, trying to make sense of the betrayal. And when she was done, she didn't feel lighter. If anything, she felt the weight more acutely. But it was different now. Tangible. Named. Real. There was no more pretending. The truth had changed her. There was no going back to who she was before, the girl who believed in the fire, who found comfort in the myth her parents had spun. That version of her was gone. In her place stood someone uncertain, wounded in a different way, not just by violence, but by deception. And though she didn't yet know what to do with that truth, she knew one thing with absolute clarity: the fire had never happened. The scars were not from flames. They were from something far worse. The house was quiet when she confronted them. She hadn't planned it, not really. For days, she'd gone back and forth in her mind, rehearsing possible conversations, picturing her parents' reactions in a dozen different ways. Sometimes she imagined them breaking down in tears, confessing everything. Other times, she feared cold denial, gaslighting, or anger. But nothing prepared her for the moment itself, for the silence between heartbeats as she stood in the living room, clutching the folder she'd removed from the drawer, and asked the question that had haunted her since she uncovered the truth. Why did you lie about the fire? Her mother turned slowly, a dish towel still in her hand, confusion written plainly across her face. Her father looked up from his seat on the couch, expression unreadable. The silence that followed her question felt unbearable, a hollow, expanding pause that made her skin crawl. What are you talking about, sweetheart? Her mother asked gently, too gently, like she was speaking to a child. The fire, she said, louder now, hands trembling. The one you said almost killed me. The one you said left these scars. She gestured to her arms, exposed and bare. There was no fire. I found the reports. There was an investigation. I was hurt by someone, not flames. Her father's face drained of color, and for a moment, he looked like a man who had just been hit in the chest. Her mother's eyes filled with tears almost instantly, but she didn't deny it. Not with words. She stepped forward, hands raised slightly, like she was approaching a wild animal. We were trying to protect you, she said, her voice cracking. You were just a baby. You didn't need to grow up with that weight. Her father finally spoke, his voice flat and gravelly. It was the only way we knew how to cope. The word stung worse than denial. Protection. Coping. As if those were valid reasons for erasing a child's truth. Her voice rose, shaking with a fury she hadn't expected. So you lied. For years. You let me believe I survived something that never happened. You let me tell other people that story. You gave me a fake identity because it was easier for you. Her mother sobbed, trying to explain. We didn't know what else to do. The investigation was closed, there was nothing we could prove, and we were so scared. You were in pain, covered in bruises and broken bones. We thought, if we told you the truth, it would crush you. But you crushed me anyway, she whispered. Her father looked away, jaw clenched, eyes glistening. It wasn't just fear. It was shame, he admitted. We left you with someone we thought we could trust. We were only gone a few hours. When we came back, his voice broke, and he swallowed hard. You were screaming. The babysitter said you fell. We wanted to believe that. We needed to believe it. He paused, then added, but when the doctors started asking questions, when CPS got involved, we realized it was more than just an accident. And by then, it was too late. We didn't know how to face it. So we built another story. Her mother nodded slowly. One we could live with. One you could grow up believing. She sat down, her legs suddenly weak, the folder slipping from her hands. Pages spilled across the coffee table, records, reports, a silent testimony to the reality they had buried. But it's not something I can live with, she said. Not anymore. You made me feel proud of something that never happened. You turned my pain into a myth. And now, I don't know who I am. Her mother tried to reach for her, but she flinched away. We didn't mean to hurt you, her mother whispered. We thought we were saving you. You saved yourselves, she replied bitterly. You saved yourselves from the truth. The room fell into a suffocating stillness. No one spoke. No one moved. For the first time in her life, she saw her parents not as protectors, but as fallible, frightened people, people who had made a choice, and in doing so, had rewritten her entire history. She didn't know yet if she could forgive them. The wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too deep. All she knew was that the truth had shattered something inside her. Something she wasn't sure could ever be whole again. In the days that followed the confrontation, the house became a quiet battlefield. No yelling, no slammed doors, just silence. A silence that hung in the air like smoke after a long burned fire, heavy and suffocating. They moved around one another carefully, as though afraid the wrong step might reopen wounds too raw to speak about. She barely looked at her parents, and when she did, it was like seeing strangers. She couldn't reconcile the image of the loving, supportive figures from her childhood with the people who had crafted a fiction so elaborate it had defined her sense of identity. Every room she walked through was laced with ghosts of lies, bedtime stories whispered in a voice she had once trusted, hugs given under false pretenses, photos on the wall that now felt staged. The comfort of home had evaporated, and in its place was a hollow shell filled with questions. She began staying in her room more often, diving into books or her journal, searching for something, anything, that felt stable. The folder with the hospital records and reports sat hidden beneath her mattress, like a forbidden truth she could no longer ignore. Some nights she would take it out and reread the documents, tracing the words with her fingertips, not because she doubted them but because she needed to remind herself it was real. The scars were real. The pain had been real. What wasn't real was the story she'd clung to for so long, a story of flames and smoke and a miracle escape. That fantasy had given her strength as a child. It had made her feel special, different, like a survivor. Now she felt like a victim of something far more sinister, the denial of truth. Despite the ache in her chest, she couldn't help but wonder about the person who had hurt her. The babysitter. The unnamed adult in the report. Their identity was a void, a shadow at the edge of every memory. Her parents had never spoken their name, even during the confrontation, they had skirted around it. Was it to protect her from more pain, or because the person was still in their lives? A family friend who showed up at holidays. A neighbor who waved from across the fence. That uncertainty was a slow torture. Every smiling adult from her childhood became a suspect in her mind. Every memory had to be re-examined under a darker light. She started digging. If her parents wouldn't give her the full truth, she would find it herself. After school, she returned to the library. She searched public records, looked through old neighborhood directories, scanned online archives of local court cases. It was slow work, and often fruitless, but it gave her a sense of control. She wasn't going to let the truth stay buried. Not again. Not after what it had already cost her. She also contacted the local child welfare office, posing as a student doing research on historical abuse investigations. They gave her a form to request access to her own child welfare records. She mailed it in the next day. At night, her dreams shifted. No more fires. Now there were shadows. Figures she couldn't see clearly. Hands reaching out. Crying. Her own voice calling out and no one answering. She would wake up breathless, tangled in her sheets, heart racing. Her mother knocked one morning and gently asked if she was sleeping okay. She didn't respond. She didn't know how to explain the storm raging inside her. That the nightmares were just reflections of the truth she could no longer repress. That the silence from her parents was as loud as screaming. One evening, her father approached her with a small box. "This belonged to you," he said softly. She hesitated before opening it. Inside were a few small items, a pacifier, a pair of baby socks, a silver bracelet etched with her name. And a photo she had never seen before. It was of her in a hospital crib, bruises visible on her tiny arms. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at her father, whose eyes were already wet. "We kept it hidden," he said. "We thought it would only hurt you." She didn't speak. She wasn't ready to offer forgiveness. But the photo, at least, was honest. Finally, something real. She pinned it to her bulletin board above her desk, next to her notes and journal entries. A symbol of what had been stolen, and what she was reclaiming. The truth, no matter how painful, was hers. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of strength that didn't come from stories or illusions. It came from knowing. From facing the darkness, unflinching. From piecing together the shattered parts of herself and choosing to rebuild. This wasn't over. The silence in the house would eventually break. More truths might surface, more confrontations might come. But she had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. She would no longer be the girl who survived a fire. She would be the girl who uncovered the truth, and survived that instead. The air outside was crisp the morning she decided to leave. Not permanently, at least, she didn't think so, but long enough to breathe air that didn't feel haunted by silence and shame. She packed quietly, methodically, folding clothes into a worn duffel bag, tucking her journal between sweaters, slipping the folder of documents at the bottom as if hiding it would make it less heavy. Her room, once a sanctuary built on imagined bravery, now felt more like a museum of a life that had never truly existed. Every photo on the wall, every quote on the corkboard, felt like a relic of someone else's mythology. She wasn't running away. She was walking out with eyes wide open. Her parents heard the front door creak open. Her mother was in the kitchen, hands trembling slightly around a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. Her father stood beside the window, watching her approach the porch. Neither of them tried to stop her. They didn't plead, didn't raise their voices. Her mother stepped forward, voice soft, uncertain. "Where will you go?" she asked. She turned to look at her. "Somewhere that doesn't feel like a lie." It wasn't cruel. It was honest. And they understood. There was no longer a script to follow, no rehearsed reassurances or false promises. They stood there, speechless, as she walked down the steps, her bag slung over her shoulder, determination in every step. She didn't know exactly where she would go, maybe to stay with a friend, maybe a small motel until she figured things out, but she knew she needed space. Not just physical distance, but emotional clarity. She needed to begin again. Somewhere where the air wasn't thick with what had been unsaid for far too long. As she walked through the streets of her neighborhood, places that once held comfort now looked like unfamiliar territory. She saw the playground where she used to pretend she was a firefighter, rescuing imaginary children from burning buildings. Back then, it had felt heroic. Now, it felt tragic. A child reenacting a fantasy crafted by adults too afraid to face what had really happened. Still, she didn't cry. She'd cried enough in the past weeks to last a lifetime. What she felt now was colder, steadier, resolve. She checked into a modest roadside inn, paid for a few nights with money she had saved from her part-time job. The room was plain, quiet. She dropped her bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. The silence here was different, emptier, but not suffocating. She took a deep breath and for the first time in days, felt like she could exhale. That night, she sat by the small desk, opened her journal, and began to write, not just about what had happened, but about what she wanted to become. She no longer wanted to be defined by survival. She wanted more than scars and secrets and stories told in half-truths. She wanted to define herself, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as someone who had the courage to uncover the truth and step forward anyway. The girl who had once clung to the fire story needed it to feel strong. But the woman she was becoming didn't need fiction to feel powerful. She had faced the real fire, hidden in lies, shame, and silence, and walked through it. In the days that followed, she called the child welfare office again and requested a meeting. She began the process of obtaining her full case file. She wanted every page, every note, every official document that held a piece of her story. She also began speaking with a counselor, someone she found through a local trauma center, someone trained not just to help people cope but to help them understand. She was tired of silence. Tired of shame. It was time to speak. When she called her parents, it was brief. Her mother answered, voice shaky, surprised. "I'm okay," she said. "I just wanted you to know. I'm not coming home. Not yet. Maybe not for a while." There was silence on the other end. Then a small, cracked, "We understand." Weeks turned into months. She didn't go back, but she didn't forget either. Healing wasn't linear. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when the weight of it all crept back in, but she had new tools now: therapy, truth, choice. She kept the photo of her as a baby beside her bed. Not because it was easy to look at, but because it was hers. A real piece of a real past. And she would build her future on truth, not illusion. Eventually, she wrote a letter to her parents. She didn't send it right away. She just needed to write it. It didn't end in forgiveness, but it ended in honesty. She told them she was working on healing, not just from what happened, but from the story they told and its place. She didn't know what their relationship would look like in the future, but she hoped, if they ever found the same courage, they could meet again, this time not in fiction, but in truth. And that, she realized, was the beginning. Not of a perfect life, not of a new fairy tale. But of something real, something hers.